Top 10 most underrated things about Classic Who. Hello and welcome to this week's video. This week I thought I'd do a bit of a general video about the top 10 things I find the most bafflingly underrated about classic, i.e. real Doctor Who. I'll go chronologically rather than kind of in any kind of preferential order. 1. Vicky. I think Vicky is a fantastic companion and fantastically underrated. It always kind of bothers me because even though you rarely hear anybody kind of bashing her or anything, you also get this sort of thing of, the original TARDIS team was the best with Ian, Barbara and Susan. And while I certainly agree with Ian and Barbara, I'm sorry, Susan was a bit crap, wasn't she? She was a bit cringe, and whether it was the writing or the actress or a mixture of both, I don't know. To me, the Hartnell era perks up enormously once Vicky clambers on board the TARDIS. She's so much fun. She's really cute. She's just got Susan does little but whine and cry and beg to be rescued. Meanwhile, Vicky leads a freaking revolution. She's enthusiastic, she's fun, she's sparky, she's into the adventure. It's a major difference between, you get this kind of character in the 80s, character difference between the likes of the perpetually whiny Tegan and the perpetually enthusiastic Ace. I'm sorry, I know which I prefer and find most entertaining. Maureen O'Brien, again, much better actress than Carol Ann Ford. Sorry, but it's true. It just kind of bugs me that Vicky often gets overlooked. Vicky's arrival also seems to coincide with a change in tone in the Hartnell era. I like season 1, but it can be a bit of a hard slog at times because it often comes across as being very, very serious. Vicky's arrival in season 2 seems to alter the foundation somewhat, making the whole series just a lot more fun. It also has an effect on Hartnell's Doctor. While Hartnell's Doctor was already developing in this direction throughout season 1, certainly there's a big difference between the Hartnell Doctor of Reign of Terror and that of An Unearthly Child. Vicky's arrival seems to only cement and further propel this change into being more like the Doctor that we know and love today. 2. Carnival of Monsters. I think Carnival of Monsters is one of the absolute best Pertwee series stories. Again, it's one of those you never really hear get slagged off, and yet you never seem to really get its kudos as well. I have to be honest, the Pertwee era is a bit of a funny one for me. I really like season 7, and there are a handful of other stories that I also really like. I also find it ironic that for me, a lot of the off-world stories I find among the weakest of the era, which is ironic considering how much Barry Letts and Terrence Dicks were pushing to abandon the Exile format and get back to going back to space. But Carnival of Monsters is the exception. It's just so much fun. It's so clever. It's so inventive. It is, of course, Robert Holmes. It also stands out in the Pertwee era by being, kind of a comedy. There's very few funny stories in the Pertwee era. Ironically, it's coming straight after another funny story in the Three Doctors. And I would argue that maybe the Time Warrior is perhaps the other funny story of the era, which isn't many. But there's still a somewhat different quality to Carnival of Monsters. Perhaps it's just a sheer array of wild and crazy ideas along with the humour. It feels very much like a Williams era story 5 years early. And coming from me, that's a big, big compliment. 3. The Sunmakers. This is another story I find really underrated. It comes from season 15, which is a season I rather like. It's very much the weakest season of the Williams era, because it's kind of caught between two stools. You've still got some of the Hinchcliffe era influence, and it hasn't really the era has yet to really find its own voice. Though the Sunmakers is perhaps the first real statement of intent of the Williams era. Again, it's Robert Holmes. It's a vicious satire on taxation, on corporatization of absolutely bloody everything. It's a great story. It's great fun. It's so funny. And the regulars are on absolutely cracking form. It's also really well made. I've never understood the criticisms of this story. It's a bit drab. Well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? It's supposed to be a miserable, depressing, grey world that nobody really wants to live on. That's kind of the point, dears. Yes. Okay. What are we at now? 4. Season 16 as a whole. Season 16 is pretty much my favourite season of Doctor Who. I find it very odd that this season is so underrated. Some people apparently don't even like it at all, which again I find just insane. No, it's not a gothic horror season. This tends to come from the Hinchcliffeites who just throwing their toys out of the pram because the show has changed styles, as though the Hinchcliffe era was, all Doctor Who was ever meant to be. Did you watch any Doctor Who before the Hinchcliffe era? Because it wasn't like the Hinchcliffe era before the Hinchcliffe era. So why is it a crime against humanity to change styles? It's an incredibly ambitious season with the first ever season arc, of course. And the thing that makes this my favourite season, apart from one of the all-time great TARDIS teams, with Tom on absolutely ripper form, Mary Tam is lovely as Romana, and K9. K9 was introduced in season 15, but again, he really comes into his own in season 16, in my opinion. This is the season where he really shines and is just an absolute beloved regular. But the other thing that makes this season my favourite season is that I don't think there's one story that falls below really, really good. The Rival Operation is one of my absolute favourite stories of the whole show. Top 10 for me. What kind of makes this, again, annoys me somewhat is the underrating that goes to stories like The Power of Kroll and the Armageddon Factor, which again, I don't get. Seeing these stories for the very first time back in the late 80s, again, I enjoyed all the season, and I enjoyed those stories. And nothing much has changed. I think The Power of Kroll is a typically fine Robert Holmes script. It's very entertaining. The effects are surprisingly decent. And the Armageddon Factor, again, it's one of those stories I've always liked, but it's one of those stories that every time I watch it, I actually like it more. It's 6 parts, but it never drags because it's full of interesting, charismatic characters that drag the story along, together with a wonderful TARDIS team. I love the hell out of season 16. Number 5. Destiny of the Daleks. I could just put the whole of season 17 here, but I'm going to be awkward. Destiny of the Daleks. This is like the Armageddon Factor. This is a story I've always liked. I always thought it was pretty good. I've never understood the bashing it gets. And like the Armageddon Factor, it's one of those stories that every time I watch it, I actually like it a little bit more. This whole era just seems to keep on getting better. And Destiny is a fine example of a story that, while I certainly may not have, certainly in the past, I wouldn't have selected as being one of the absolute best of the era. Again, it just stands up so well. I do find it comical almost, the degree of bile that got spat at this story. Apparently just because it had a few jokes in episode 1. When in comparison to the majority of the Pertwee Dalek stories, like the God-Awful Death 2 and the God-Awful Planet, and in comparison to the massively overrated, tedious macho bollocks that is Resurrection of the Daleks, whose own author thinks is the worst Doctor Who script ever written. Presumably he said that before New Who came along, but still. Destiny stands up very, very, very well. 6. The Horns of Naomi. Again, this is another story that is just insanely underrated, apparently, because fans have no sense of freaking humour. I saw this story for the very first time back in 1991, late 91, after emigrating to Australia. It was on like the ABC, like the afternoon show, which is where I saw a lot of these stories for the first time, including a lot of season 18 that I hadn't seen before. Now, I was already well versed enough in fandom to get to hear the whole season 17 is shit and the Horns of Naomi is one of the worst stories ever. Now, the only things I'd seen of season 17 prior to this point were Destiny and City. Always liked Destiny, loved City. And I watched the rest of season 17 with a kind of adult bemusement. I didn't actually see Creature from the Pit at the time. That I must have missed that. But the Horns of Naomi in particular just absolutely baffled me. I sat down to watch this supposedly hideously awful story and found a really clever, really witty, really fun and really entertaining romp. I didn't get it then. 30 years later, I still don't get it. Get a sense of humour, for crying out loud, people. 7. State of Decay. I'm not a big fan of season 18. In fact, I think it's wildly overrated. The wild overcorrection of the supposedly excess humour of the previous season results in many stories being incredibly dry and boring. The exception to this is State of Decay. No thanks to script editor Christopher H. Bidmead, who did his very best to try and make it as boring as his other stories, but was thankfully vetoed by the director and John Nathan Turner. The result is the best story of the season by a very, very long way, and a fantastic gothic horror vampire story. Again, this is a story you rarely see getting insulted or anything, but it also never seems to get the kudos and the love that it really deserves, because this is absolutely up there with the very best of the Hinchcliffe era as a gothic Doctor Who story goes. I absolutely love it. Tom and Lala are on fantastic form. You really, really, really can't beat it. 8. The Sixth Doctor. I'm putting the Sixth Doctor here as a whole. I think Colin's a great Doctor. I think he was completely screwed over by the BBC, Michael Grade in particular. I don't think he was necessarily helped by certain factors on the production team, such as that costume. Although, to be fair, he kind of pulls it off in his first season at least. I think he was... I don't... Again, you hear the YouTube ignorati banging on about the bad scripts and that. And while I agree that Trial is something of a disappointment, I find season 22, again, wildly underrated. And I could almost have included that here on its own. I just don't get it. Colin's a magnetic Doctor. He is somewhat shortchanged by the fact that he's really only got 2 seasons, one of which is shorter than the other, and one of which is not very good, while the other is brilliant. But the fact that he still gets shortchanged, he still gets underrated, and there's still a section of fandom that still blames him for the ridiculous BBC politics and behind the scenes crap, is just indicative of how short-sighted and brain-dead some of fandom actually is. That's just my opinion. 9. Attack of the Cybermen. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I saw Attack of the Cybermen in the late 80s after having just become a fan. Again, I was already steeped enough in fan culture to know the legend of how bad the Sixth Doctor was and how bad his stories were. I got like a collection of stories from a friend that I'd just made who had loads of old pirate Doctor Who stories. I got one from each of the pre-Sylvester Doctors. The one I got for Colin was Attack of the Cybermen. I wasn't particularly looking forward to it in comparison to most of the others. Ironically, apart from maybe the Tom and the Davisons, which were Fang Rock and Earthshock, I enjoyed the Attack of the Cybermen way more than almost anything else that I saw that time. I thought it was a fantastically exciting, well-written, well-made story with a great Doctor Some great guest characters, some great guest and some great dialogue. And every time I see it again, I think exactly the same thing. Why this story gets so bashed is another utter mystery to me. I look at their arguments and I just think you're just talking complete bollocks. Because everything they say, you can say against other stories that they'll defend. Ooh, it's violent. Well, so's a lot of the Hinchcliffe era, and yet you guys, can't stop salivating over that. Ooh, there's continuity, yeah, which is all explained in the story. And, so, what's the problem exactly? It baffles me even more when this story is literally a sister to the previous season's Resurrection of the Daleks, which does exactly the same things, being very violent and having loads of continuity. Only the difference is Attack of the Cybermen is incredibly well written, and Resurrection of the Daleks is, as I've already said, complete gobshite. Yeah, fandom just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me most of the time, I have to be honest. 10. The McCoy era. I'm citing the era as a whole as being incredibly fucking underrated. Perhaps less so these days. I am aware that like the last 10, 15 years or so, the newer generation of fans have rather taken to it. But you still get the mindless McCoy bashing from people who just come out with absolute drivel. It particularly aggravates me. I think one of the things that particularly aggravates me, you get it from the likes of Pertwee era fans who will happily sit there and tell you with a straight face that something like The Time Monster is better than Survival. I'm sorry, you're not so much looking at your era with rose-tinted glasses as you are mentally fucking challenged. How anyone can actually hold that opinion and talk and chew gum at the same time is utterly beyond me. I'm sorry, but what the hell is wrong with you? Now, to be sure, the McCoy era does get off to a bit of a rocky start with season 24, though a lot of that is still pretty fun, and certainly no more immature than a lot of the, let's face it, New Who. But certainly after that first season, the McCoy era just turns into an absolutely fantastic era with some of the best stories in the show's history, a brilliant doctor, a brilliant companion. It's still one of my favourite eras, second pretty much only to the Williams era. Although, I do kind of have a yen for Troughton, I must admit. But yeah, it's one of my favourite eras, and I think it's a shame it's still criminally underrated by stupid people today. Anyway, that's my top 10 things that I think are most underrated in Classic Who. Maybe I'll do a top 10 things that are most overrated to really annoy people. Bye for now.